Thank you very much. Well, again, we're celebrating our 100th anniversary, and we want to give tribute to our industry partners and our incredible warfighters. And as I said yesterday, ultimately, I believe everyone in this room, everyone in the Pentagon, we all have the same goal in mind, is to make sure those young men and women have all the capability, the equipment, and the training to do the mission our nation asks them to do. This morning, we're very fortunate to have the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition Enablers, Ms. Stacy Cummings. She's a career member of the Senior Executive Service and currently serves in this position. She has a varied background. She's been in the Federal Railroad Administration, Department of Transportation. She's been in the Department of Navy. She is a career civil servant, and as she said to me, any day out of the Pentagon's a good day, so I think she's really happy to be here. It's great to have Ms. Cummings here for our morning keynote. Ms. Cummings?
So much. Yes, I am ecstatic to be here in Tampa. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be representing the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, the Honorable Miss Ellen Lord. So I'm going to talk to you today about what we're doing in the department around innovation in acquisition and acquisition reform. And thank you for that introduction. The organization that I work for is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition. I'm serving as his principal deputy. I am also the lead of a new organization called Acquisition Enablers. And what we've done is, in the organizational split between what used to be the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, we've separated research and engineering and acquisition and sustainment. The purpose of my office is really to be thinking about how do we enable the services and how do we enable the co-coms, how do we enable the warfighters to get the capability that they need in support of the National Defense Strategy. Okay. Oh, there we go. So my office is new, and as am I in this job. I am entering into my 3rd month. So I'm happy to be here to be able to talk to you about what we're doing across the Office of Acquisition and Sustainment, but most specifically around acquisition reform. So we are driven by the National Defense Strategy, and as many of you know, and I think that this has been talked about throughout the week, there are 3 major pillars of the National Defense Strategy. First, lethality, build a more lethal force. This is where the Office of Acquisition and Sustainment is really focused on modernizing capability, delivering capability at speed, as well as readiness for the warfighter. Looking at alliances and partnerships. And I know that strengthening alliances and attracting new partners, a lot of times we talk about international partners or different types of partners. When we're talking about partnerships in the Office of Acquisition and Sustainment, we're really talking about industry. We're talking about you. We're talking about how do we bring innovative defense industrial-based partners, non-traditional partners into the defense industrial base, and then also how do we partner with industry to make sure that we're protecting our data and make sure that we are developing systems using the best commercial best practices and being innovative about the way we deliver capability. And then business reform, reforming the department for greater performance and affordability. One of the major attributes of the split of the Undersecretary of Defense Office for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics was also pushing decision-making in the acquisition area, in the acquisition arena, down to the lowest possible level. And the reason we do that is because the people that are closest to the decisions are the ones that have the most information, and we want to empower them, give them the tools that they need, the information they need to make the best possible decision, and we want to reduce as much as possible overhead that's not value added. And so as we look at business reform, we're really looking at acquisition reform, and the purpose of my office is really to look at how do we reduce the burden, how do we reduce the time it takes to get a program started, to get things on contract, to get a capability in the hands of the warfighter, and then to field that capability as rapidly as possible. And so over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about some of the different pathways and some of the different reform efforts that we're working on, and I'll definitely leave some time for questions at the end as well. All right, so the acquisition and sustainment philosophy, as we transition again from the Office of Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics and split into 2 offices, the Offices of Research Engineering and Acquisition and Sustainment, we pulled out aspects that used to be part of AT&L and pushed them over to the Office of Research Engineering to create this sort of Chief Technology Officer, an office that's really focused on looking forward, looking at investments that are going to, in the long term, bring new and innovative capabilities into the acquisition system that we can get them in the hands of the warfighter. But what is the Office of Acquisition and Sustainment focused on? We're really shifting from being an office that does oversight to really creating policy and governance that enables the services, enables the the component acquisition executive, and enables program executive officers and program managers to be able to, again, make decisions at the lowest level and not have to bring every decision up to OSD, up to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. We want to enable good decision making, enable speed, enable relevance, and not create additional burdens around paperwork or briefings or things that are not adding value. We want to make sure we're adding value. We want to shift to be a more data-driven organization. And so we're really focused on how do we collect that minimum amount of data that allows Ms. Lord to look across the Department of Defense acquisition enterprise and be able to look at trends, be able to look at performance, and say, what can we do in the Office of the Secretary of Defense to better enable program managers to be able to get capability to the warfighter faster. We want to move away from being in silos that keep us from being able to share lessons learned and best practices and really enable those best practices at scale. And we want to be able to institutionalize those best practices in policy. Again, policy that is not adding additional bureaucratic burden, but is focused on enabling program managers and enabling program executive officers to be able to make those best decisions. And then moving away from being risk adverse and really taking risks, but knowing what those risks are, creating a creative compliance environment where we're understanding what the risk is, we're tailoring in those requirements that are going to be specifically for mitigating the risks that we have identified, as opposed to creating a compliance structure that assumes that every risk is a risk for every program. So I think that any of us, and I'm sure all of us have been in the acquisition community in some way for years, have stories about things where you just know that somebody added this requirement because of potentially a single bad actor or a single failure in the system. And now everyone has to do that compliance activity, not because it is a risk associated with your program, but because it was a risk associated with someone else's program. My boss, Mr. Kevin Fahey, had an open testimony last week on a company called TransDigm. And what it was really focused around was there is a company that has a business model that is, how do we charge the most for parts that are mission critical to the Department of Defense? And if you read any of the press around this particular hearing, what we really want to make sure we're doing is we are focusing our risk management on the risks of that particular program and not creating new rules and regulations for everyone based on the actions of one program or one set of contractors. And so if you haven't had a chance to read the media around that or see that hearing, I would encourage you to do so, because it was really a good example of where you cannot necessarily regulate your way out of everything. We need to be looking at our programs and managing our risks individually to the characteristics of those programs. And what we really want to do in the Office of Acquisition Enablers is to take those best practices and lessons learned and really take out regulations and really manage risk as an individual characteristic of programs. So when you look across our acquisition reform vision, we're looking predominantly at how do we increase speed, how do we take the friction out of the system so that we can deliver capabilities to the warfighter as quickly as possible. So the first thing I talked about earlier was restructuring the acquisition organization. We are also restructuring our policy and our governance structures to push decision-making to the lowest level possible. Contracting at the speed of relevance. We're taking a lot of action right now to reduce how long it takes to get a contracting action complete. So many of you have heard about other transaction authority. We have increased our use of other transaction authority by about 20-fold over the last several years. And we've really recognized that as we partner up other transaction authorities with some of the other pathways in acquisition, like middle tier, we're able to bring in innovative technologies as well as non-traditional providers of technologies and get them into the hand of the warfighter as quickly as possible, either through rapid prototyping or rapid fielding. Some of the other things we're looking at in the area of contracting is how many clauses we currently have and what are some of the clauses that we can reduce as far as mandatory clauses. These are things that might increase the amount of time it takes to get on contract, but it also may keep some non-traditional partners from wanting to compete. And so we're looking at those different clauses to see what are some that we can reduce so that we can, again, reduce the burden on our program managers and contracting officers, as well as reduce the burden on our industry partners and take away some of the barriers to either competition or to good negotiating practices. Strengthening and securing the defense industrial base. So this is a very, very high priority for Ms. Lord and for the Secretary of Defense. So we did an evaluation of the defense industrial base, and we've identified risks that we are now going out and tackling, and one of those risks is really how do we protect our data? So we have government data that the government protects. We have government data that industry protects. And how do we partner with our industry partners to be able to have trust in the system, to be able to enable best practices across the defense industrial base? And so we've really increased our one-on-one communication with industry associations. We've also increased our communications with our industry partners to really talk about how are you protecting our data and what can we do together to make sure that we're sharing information and that we're enabling you with the best possible tools to protect our data. Some of the things, and I'll talk about this on the next slide, but some of the things that we're doing around protecting the defense industrial base are really exciting, and we're doing some pathways that I think are going to give us a lot of really good information about how we're able to do that in partnership. And then effective training of the acquisition workforce. So again, I hearken back to what I said earlier about those of us who have been in the acquisition community for a long time. You probably have stories about 4, 6, 8, 20-week training courses that you may have attended. And we've really focused in the past on getting a certification that is very broad, but not necessarily tailored to the job that you're in or the job that you're going to. So how do we transform the way that we train and develop our acquisition workforce across all the different types of jobs that you might have? My last job was as a program executive officer for the Defense Healthcare Management Systems. I was delivering an electronic health record that was a commercial off-the-shelf tool, both garrison as well as to the operational environment. There is a very tailored set of skills that I and my program managers and my contracting officer needed in order to be successful at that job. But in order to get certified, in order to have that job, we had to go to hours and weeks and even months of training on things that may have nothing to do with the specific job that I was going into. We want to also be encouraging people who are going to be delivering software to embrace agile techniques. But if we're training everybody on everything and we're not targeting our training specifically to what that job is going to be, we end up creating generalists when in some cases what we need are specialists. And so we're really looking at how do we leverage the Defense Acquisition University and how do we leverage commercial training to bring together the right training at the right time for the right people to enable the best possible outcomes to deliver capability to the warfighter. And so across these 4 areas of acquisition reform, we are focused on doing several things that we anticipate having complete this year. And so I'm going to talk about a few of them. I know there are a lot on the list. I won't talk about all of them in detail, but feel free to during the question period. If there's one you want to do a deep dive on that I didn't end up talking about, please let me know. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about pilots to revise software development, acquisition, and sustainment. So we recently released a Defense Innovation Board software acquisition and practices study that had a breadth of really, really interesting industry people look, as well as government, look at how we deliver software in the Department of Defense. And the big thing that they came back with is that We have policies and training and capabilities in place that encourage us to deliver software the same way we deliver hardware, which is in a waterfall methodology where basically whether you're a software program like I was just delivering, or whether you're a weapon system that has a lot of software embedded in it, we have encouraged and incentivized the outcome of delivering software when it's done, and then going through months of testing, and then going back and fixing things that we found in test. This is not how the commercial industry does it, and this is not how you deliver capability in a modern Department of Defense and to be able to compete with our competitors. So we have several Agile Pilots that are ongoing right now. So we're looking at how do we, again, take away the barriers for program managers and our industry partners to be able to deliver capability at the speed of the warfighters' need. And so we have done some Agile Pilots. We've gotten this study that we've shared with Congress. And what we're doing right now is tackling a couple of things, one of them being a software acquisition pathway. So today, if you're delivering software and you're doing so using the traditional acquisition processes, again, there are barriers in place for you to be able to do what's best for that particular program. So I'm really excited about this. This is something that we've been talking about aggressively in the department, and we are going to, as quickly as possible, get some enabling policy out so that we can encourage and enable our program managers to deliver software at a much faster speed and get that capability out to the warfighter in partnership with the users. One of the other things that came out of the study was looking at how we fund software. So I talked about some of the barriers around policy. We also fund software as if it were hardware. So there is no beginning, middle, and end of software. Software is immortal, is what the study tells us. And so if software is immortal and it doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and an end, how can you possibly fund it using procurement, R&D, and operation and sustainments? So how do we, and this is one of the study recommendations, how do we pilot or pathway some programs that will enable us to learn more about the best way to fund software that is immortal? And so we're looking to partner with Congress over the next couple of years to do some pathways in that area. So a lot of work in the area of software, and if any of you or any of us think that we are not involved in software, we are. All programs and all weapon systems have an element of software to them, whether it's 90% or 9%, and being able to enable the delivery of that capability faster is how we are going to be competitive. So I talked a little bit about our acquisition workforce initiatives and really focused on giving the right training to the right people at the right time for the job that they're about to go into. I talked a little bit about some of those missions. Mission engineering capability. So this is an area of, we got some feedback from the 809 panel, if any of you have heard about the 809 panel. This was a multi-year study that looked at acquisition practices. They gave us a lot of really great recommendations. Some of them are pretty easy to implement. Some of them require some legislative assistance in implementing them. But one of the things that they talked about was how do you look across a portfolio? How do you manage across a mission? And so this is an area that my office and the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition is looking at. How do we bring mission engineering and really look across portfolios or mission threads in how we deliver capability? How do we put that into policy? And how do we operate in a way that we're making smart investments and we understand what those cross-program dependencies are as we're investing in programs and program delivery? All right, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the adaptive acquisition framework. So this may be the first time you've seen this many lines on the adaptive acquisition framework. Today, if you go to the Defense Acquisition University website, you will not see all of the lines that I have on this slide. The first thing that you'll see that's different is that software pathway that's in between the tailorable traditional and the acquisition of services. You'll also see on the left cybersecurity and our focus on cybersecurity, and I'll talk a little bit about that in some of our pathways that we're implementing over the next year or so. So let's start with urgent operational needs. This is really a capability that I think that the special operations community has taken advantage of and has done a really good job at that. And it gives us the ability to take very, very quick urgent needs and get them into the warfighter's hand as quickly as possible. And then we have our tailorable traditional, which is the third line down. This is how you would deliver a program that was a large traditional weapon system like a submarine or a fighter jet or a helicopter or a new series of vehicles. The Congress realized is that there are some things that fit in between those two. So you can't develop them and get them in the hands of the warfighter in a year or two, but you don't necessarily need to take the time and investment in order to do a, sorry, my screen just went blank. Thank you. In order to deliver that capability in a 12, 13-year time frame. And so the Congress gave us a capability called middle tier acquisition. So what they were looking for is what are those things that are in between the traditional and the urgent need that you can deliver either a rapid prototype within 5 years, meaning you can get an operational capability that you can leave behind in the form of a prototype, or rapidly field within 5 years. I think that this is a capability that is very attractive to the special operations community because it enables you to take commercially mature technology and do very little changes to it or integrate it into a larger suite of capabilities, deliver it to the warfighter, and get immediate feedback. What we want to be doing here in the middle tier is really failing quickly because we want to learn right away whether a capability is going to be useful, and we want to learn right away, did we deliver it in the right way, and did we integrate it properly and get it into the hands of the user. So in 2016, we got this authority. It actually wasn't very widely used until last year when Ms. Lord signed out some enabling interim policy, and we now have over 40 middle tier programs active in the department, and by the end of the year I expect there to be 50 active middle tier acquisition programs. I talked a little bit about, actually I talked a lot about software when we were on our last slide. We don't have a software pathway right now, so when I tell you that this is the first time that most people are seeing this adaptive acquisition framework in this form, this software pathway is aspirational, and it is something that we are working on this year. Acquisition of services and defense business systems are also pathways that have been available, and those too take away some of the burdens from doing that tailorable traditional DoD 5000. But the thing that I want to focus on here is that we're learning a lot from the middle tier interim policy, and we're in what Ms. Lord calls the messy middle. And we're using middle tier to learn more about the capability, to learn more about what characteristics of a program make the most sense. But we're not saying that adding the middle tier solves all of our speed problems, because there are definitely cases where we have the characteristics of the program make sense for the middle tier, but there are also cases where the characteristics make sense to use the tailorable traditional model. The problem is our tailorable traditional model has been used by the Department of Defense in what we call a tailor out, meaning that there's all these requirements and you can work with your milestone decision authority to take things out. We want to shift the paradigm, and what we're working on this year is rewriting almost all of the policies you see on this adaptive acquisition framework, and we want to shift the paradigm from a tailor out to a tailor in, meaning that we want to, in policy, require the minimum amount of oversight and paperwork and documentation that is necessary for the characteristics of your program. So we don't want to say, here are all the things you have to do, but you can ask permission to take them out. That we want to shift the paradigm to say, you must do these basic things. You must have a good acquisition strategy that is a contract between the program manager and the milestone decision authority. And that acquisition strategy, that contract, will include what are the documentation, what is the research, what is the work that you need to do in advance of starting a program, and what do you need to do throughout the program to manage your risk and to get the best possible outcome for warfighters. So we're really looking at changing the paradigm and restructuring the majority of the documentation that you see here over the next year in a series of policy, DoD instructions updates, but also policy updates that will enable the program manager to really take control of their program, working with their milestone decision authority, get capability into the hands of the warfighter as quickly as possible. And this adaptive acquisition framework and the development of these policies are what my office was stood up to do. And so I have here a lot of sort of arrows going back and forth, and the reason that they're there is because there are going to be times a single weapon system, a single program may move between these pathways either throughout the life cycle or even within the same part of the life cycle. So for example, if you are a software intensive weapon system, and I will take a generic flying vehicle. You are a generic flying vehicle, and we're doing a development of the airframe, the structure, the engine, the avionics, and the software systems that are needed to fly that system. There are also other enabling softwares that the way we buy that now we would put them all together and we would deliver them using that waterfall methodology, and you wouldn't see that enabling software until the weapon system was ready to fly. What we want to be able to do is enable program managers when it makes sense to say, I'm going to manage my software on a different path. I'm not going to use that traditional milestone, those traditional milestone events, because A, I can develop that software and get it into the hands of the user and get feedback faster, but B, you may be able to use that software not just on this generic flying vehicle, but on other generic vehicles that whether they fly or not. So if we can create a more modular approach to the way that we buy capabilities, we can deliver them faster, we can get them in the hands of the user faster, we can test them faster, and we can reuse them when it makes sense across the Department of Defense. And so what we're doing here is creating an ecosystem, so a framework that again allows the services, the program managers, the program executive officers to really pick the pathway that makes the most sense for the delivery of that capability, the characteristics of the outcome you're looking for, and the risk associated with your program. Some of the other things we're working on in the area of software is how do you enable programs to use software capability and deliver software capability in an agile way. Well, right now, if we were going to go out and build a new software capability, we'd probably end up also buying all of the infrastructure, whether it was cloud or whether it was local infrastructure, we would end up buying all those tools, and we would create that software in our own infrastructure that we developed for ourselves. In software, in the commercial world, that's not how you deliver software capability. In a DevSecOps, development security operations environment, you have a platform of tools that you can deliver capability very rapidly, and you can build security, cybersecurity in as you're building it. So in addition to creating this software pathway, we're also doing some pathfinders to be able to build infrastructure, so package tools and package them in containers that any program in the Department of Defense, any commercial partner on contract with the Department of Defense can leverage that capability and begin building their software deliverables much faster because we've already made sure that they're cyber secure. We've already ensured that they have the right tools, that they're up to date, that they have their cyber patches. So instead of doing that over and over again on each program, we're creating a voluntary use pathfinder where that capability is available and you can reuse modules and put them back in for somebody else to use. So we're really excited about that. That's another one of the recommendations that came out of the Defense Innovation Board. And over the next several years, you'll see us developing pathfinders, and there'll be many programs that are going to be taking advantage of this. On the left, I talked about cybersecurity. I will tell you that in my last job, I was delivering an electronic health record that was a commercial off-the-shelf tool being provided on a commercial cloud infrastructure, and cybersecurity was the thing that I spent most of my time on. Because in the DoD, we have a different set of rules and expectations around cybersecurity. And so we were securing where our data was stored because that data was being accessed directly by the Department of Defense and, in the future, the Department of Veterans Affairs. But what we're looking to do as we look to the future is to say everybody who is part of our ecosystem, all of our defense industrial base, needs to have a level of cybersecurity, and that needs to be a requirement. That needs to be just like you need to have a building, you need to have people, you need to have cybersecurity. And there is a level of cybersecurity that would be a minimum level of cybersecurity, and depending on what you're doing, that requirement goes up, depending on the risk, depending on the type of data that we're storing, that you are creating and storing across the different companies. So we're really looking at cybersecurity and how do we figure out how to mature cybersecurity across the defense industrial base, create minimum standards, working, taking advantage of NIST, but really having those minimum standards, building up from there, creating that level of trust. And we're actually looking at partnering with the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, as well as the Software Engineering Institute from Carnegie Mellon, to establish a maturity model, create those certification specifications, and then be able to certify industry so that you do that certification once for all the programs that you're supporting. And we know that there is a level of trust with a particular industry partner, as well as with all the subs that are associated with that industry partner. Now, clearly, we need to look at how we bring small business into this cybersecurity maturity model, and that is also one of the things we're focused on, is how do we create the right environment so that small business can actively participate in a cyber-secure manner. So you'll be hearing more about this over the next year or so. We expect to have some pathfinders by the end of the calendar year. So when you look at this entire adaptive acquisition framework, what we're really, again, focused on is how do we speed the delivery of capability to the warfighter? How do we leverage software, and how do we embed users in the process, in the system, so that we are getting feedback early, we're delivering the minimum amount of capability for the warfighter to start using immediately, and in that we're being good stewards of the taxpayer dollar, as well as good stewards of the taxpayer data, by securing that data and securing our entire ecosystem between the DoD as well as our industry partners. All right, and I think I left plenty of time for questions. My last slide here is acquisition reform all the time. When I took this job, the thing that Ms. Lord said to me is that we are creating your office so that we do not have to go out and do something special for acquisition reform. Basically, the idea is that I have the right people in my organization who can look across the acquisition enterprise from a data perspective, with insight into all of the programs across the DoD, and we can take best practices and we can develop enabling policies and enabling practices so that we are reforming acquisition all the time. It's not something special that we do once and then wait a few years. We're doing it all the time, and we're always looking for better ways to do things. And I will say, I think that SOCOM is a great example of where we can find some of those best practices, and really appreciate them embracing rapid prototyping, rapid fielding, and I know we're going to learn a lot as we're going through this messy middle and as we're developing final policy that will enable middle tier as well as all these other acquisition pathways across the department. All right, so the first question, and this is really cool, this Slido. So the first question is, with all the new policies and procedures OSD is implementing, what are they doing to educate the DoD acquisition workforce to keep up with the pace of change? So that's a really good question. The Defense Acquisition University president actually does report in through the Office of Acquisition and Sustainment. And I've been down there several times to talk to them about how we're going to do this. So one of the things that they've done is they're able to bring in under contract some commercial training so that we're not waiting to develop the government workforce to be able to train the government workforce on new approaches like Agile. So we are bringing in some commercial training and commercial technology. The other thing we're doing is I have a full-time DAU professor who's actually dedicated to me so that as we are developing these new acquisition policies, we're going to go out and do listening sessions with students. And we're going to go do listening sessions with PEOs and program managers, as well as with industry. And so we're going to, before we actually sign the policy, we're going to start engaging with people to get their feedback. And then we're going to use that connection to the Defense Acquisition University to start inserting these new approaches into training. I've asked if we can have a PEO PM forum, which would be a great way to get the word out so we can get the acquisition workforce informed and up to speed. And then the other thing we're doing, and I'm really excited about this, is in the past, you had a very long document that was a policy that sat on a shelf, and if you needed to reference it, you'd go look through it, or maybe you'd look through it in PDF online. We want to transition the way we use the Defense Acquisition University website to create a more interactive experience. So what I would envision is that you're a program manager and you're about to enter into delivering a new capability, and it's going to end up being an acquisition program, that you actually interact with this system to help you decide, is this appropriate for a middle tier? Am I a predominantly software program, and should I be using that software pathway? So we really want to leverage technology and leverage the Defense Acquisition University's website to help us do that. So that was a really good question. The acquisition process, so this is risky because I'm reading it out loud to you as I'm reading it. The acquisitions process has been counterproductive for C4 and now even more with cyber. What's being done to revamp and streamline that process? So I think I talked a lot about streamlining the acquisition process, and especially creating this new software pathway that will enable you to come out of that traditional acquisition, the traditional DoD 5000.02, and really deliver capabilities outside of that waterfall delivery. What we've done with our Agile Pilots is we've given them very special authorities to not use the traditional system. We're going to extend those, and as we're developing this policy, our plan is to have interim policy out by the end of the year so that all programs can start leveraging that software pathway without having to wait until we've gone through the sort of traditional DoDI rulemaking process. So just like we did with the middle tier, where we got enabling policy out quickly, we're going to do the same thing in the area of software. So again, we want the program manager to be looking across the breadth of their pathways and picking the one that makes the most sense for their capability delivery. How do the policies of your office encourage the contracting workforce, the 1102s, to accept the risks needed to get capability to the warfighter faster, I assume, rather than, I'm not going to guess. I'll just say faster. So yeah, that's a really good point. And when I talked about the DAU certification and who has the most hours of DAU certification, it's the 1102s. And so we have placed a lot of requirements on our contracting officers in order to get to certified, which means that we've invested a lot in training them across a very broad set of capabilities. And this is another area where I think taking advantage of reducing the amount of time for certifications and really focus on training the acquisition workforce specifically for the job that they're about to do. So again, as we're moving forward with this new way of looking at certifications and training, I could envision our 1102s are actually going to Agile software training. Why? Not so that they can learn how to deliver Agile, but so that they can learn how to negotiate with the contracting community how to put the best possible vehicles out so that they're enabling really that back and forth to be able to have industry recommending things like agile software development and the use of DevSecOps. Some of the other things that we've done is the OTA, the Other Transaction Authority. I told you that we're about 20-fold over the last couple of years in increased use of other transactions. I know my contracting officer on my last program took advantage of the Defense Acquisition University guidebook and was able to start using OTAs where it made sense in the delivery of capability for the electronic health record. And so yeah, communication is always the hardest thing to do. Writing the policy is going to be the easy part. How do we get it out and make sure that people are able to take advantage of all these different capabilities? One thing I was talking earlier about was how excited I was to hear about the Air Force's pitch day. And I think widely sharing the sort of innovative ways that the different services and PEOs and programs are taking advantage of these different capabilities is the best way to allow for our 1102s to start pulling that information because you can't push enough to get innovation out into the workforce. We really need them to be pulling it. And so setting high expectations for our contracting staff, contracting officer and contract specialist staff, and encouraging PEOs and program managers to be asking those right questions. When will USDA NS reporting for MTAs align with the goal for pushing decision authority to the lowest level? So yeah, great question. Right now, as I said earlier, Ms. Lord's been calling the middle tier acquisition where we are right now, the messy middle. And what that means is that we've pushed very far forward and we've put out very little guidance on when you cannot, and how to use middle tier acquisition. And we did that very purposefully because we wanted to be able to test and demonstrate what a middle tier can be successful in achieving and identify what are the challenges in a middle tier acquisition. When we write and propagate our final middle tier policy, I expect that we'll have a different level of reporting that'll be required. But while we're in this messy middle, we're really trying to learn as much as possible to inform the development of that policy. And so we're in negotiations right now. We have a working group that's working on collaboratively developing the middle tier policy. But until we get that final middle tier policy out, we are collecting additional information on middle tier at the OSD level that we wouldn't traditionally collect for programs of that size. And really it's so that we all have that same message and we're able to share how we're using this authority with our overseeing committees of Congress so that we can share them with leadership in the Department of Defense so that we can continue to take advantage of this capability, which we think is very valuable and we definitely want to continue to use. So the when, certainly for the next year, for the rest of the year, I would anticipate this same level of reporting. And then as the final policy comes out, which we're shooting for the end of the year to do that, I would expect to see a different level of reporting. Let's see, so with empowering the lowest level to make acquisition decisions, how do we have oversight to ensure collaboration and reduce singular efforts and redundancy? So that's a great question, and I think that's certainly one that we worry about in the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition Office, because traditionally there was a great deal of individual program visibility at the OSD level. And by pushing decision making to the lowest level, what we really need to be able to do is to leverage data instead of leveraging oversight meetings. And so we do collect data, and actually the collection of that data does fall within my portfolio. We do collect data that each of the services put into a system that we're able to look at the health of the enterprise and look across the different programs and be able to identify risks and best practices. And that's how we inform our development of policy. I think equally important is how do we at the at the Secretary of Defense level look across the portfolio or the mission thread to make sure that we're making investments in the right places. And I think that that's something that, that we need to continue to focus on and work on. One of the ways we're doing that is looking at bringing mission engineering into the into our acquisition policy and into our acquisition procedures. And then another, that is actually one of the recommendations that came out of the 809 Streamlining Acquisition Practices study that was released earlier this year. So it's a great question, and I think it's one that we're going to continue to work on that balance between collecting data versus oversight, and how do we use that data to manage across the portfolio and across missions. All right. A lot of changes outlining likely required culture change within the DoD acquisition workforce. How will we address that? So that is a really good point, and we talk about this a lot, especially when we're talking about software. So certainly the culture in the DoD is not necessarily aligned across all of the different types of things that we do to deliver Agile software and get things into the hands of the warfighter. There are a lot of different equities that are involved in that process, and ANS can focus on the things that are in our portfolio to oversee, but there are certainly other offices within the department that have equal equities, and we need to work together to make sure that all of our equities are being addressed as we push oversight down through the organization to the lowest possible level. To me, culture is not something that you can change like that. Culture is something that changes over time. And one of the ways that we're changing culture, and I hear it all the time when I ask about middle tier acquisition is really all about changing the culture around the acquisition process. And again, looking at those different people that have different equities and making sure that they understand how they fit into it. When I talk about middle tier, a great example is we have a different threshold for requirements generation in a middle tier than we do in a traditional acquisition process. That doesn't mean requirements aren't important. It means that we're changing the way that we look at requirements in order to be an input into a very rapid system. Same thing with tests. When I think about Agile software development, you can't develop software agilely, deliver minimum viable products, and then wait until you're done to test it. How do we bring in the operational testers and the development testers early into the program, early into that delivery during our pilots, so that they understand how their equities are being met, and then we change the culture over time? It's a really great question, and culture is definitely one of the, it's something that you cannot actively change by trying to change culture. You have to look at culture as being a collection of leadership, policy, experience, and culture is going to change over time. And that's why Ms. Lord is very focused on these pathfinders or pilot programs, so that as we change culture in a small group, they're able to be evangelists and go out and look at changing culture across a larger group. Okay, I have one last question. Let's see, I'm just going to look at them all and see which one I want to answer in that case. So I will actually go ahead and just pick the top one. So how can we streamline the statutory cybersecurity process to support rapid acquisition while ensuring our fielded systems are defended against cyber attack? So this is a great question, and as I said, cybersecurity is something that I know much more about than I ever thought I would, being the deployer of an electronic health record. The biggest thing to me, and this is one of the things whenever I would go out to a healthcare conference or community, is building cybersecurity in from the beginning, not trying to build it in at the end. And so we have, in the past around cybersecurity, had what I would call a checklist mentality, meaning you develop your software, you develop your infrastructure, you develop your capability, and then you check it at the end. And then you go back and fix what you found during your checking. That is not how you build cybersecurity into any system, whether it's a weapon system or whether it's a software system or an infrastructure. We really have to be building cybersecurity in from the beginning, and we need to be looking at how to create those enabling infrastructures and platforms so that every program doesn't have to start from scratch building cybersecurity in. I'm really excited about DevSecOps. So DevSecOps is, again, I talked about it a little earlier, the sec is security. Sometimes you'll hear it called DevOps. We call it DevSecOps for a very, very important reason. As we're building these reusable containers using commercial off-the-shelf and open source tools, we are cyber securing the container. So when you take that container and you pull it from the shared infrastructure, you use it to develop your solution, and then you put it back into the ecosystem, we're using automated tools to keep it patched, to make sure it's cyber secure, and make sure that it's using the most up-to-date tools and technology. If we have to do that over and over again and develop that for every single program, it is going to become unaffordable. And so the idea of creating shared platforms where you can go and look at whether it's the joint AI command, whether it's the what we're doing up at Kessel Run, whether it's one developed by the Navy or the Air Force, you can look across those different DevSecOps environments, and you know that when you're using the tools to develop your software, you're building cybersecurity in. And so I think we need to get away from this checklist mentality, be more looking at building cybersecurity in from the beginning, and then leveraging the pilots that I talked about earlier around securing the defense industrial base so that our entire ecosystem is secure. And I will also say one of the biggest things that I learned is you can't stop at doing a checklist and determining that you're secure, because the next day you're not. And so we need to bring together a layered approach to cybersecurity. So we need to build security into our software and infrastructure, but we also need to be doing constant monitoring, constant defending, and we need to be able to know immediately when there's been any sort of attempt at an attack that we can respond to very quickly. So that's my theory on cybersecurity that I would say was built with lots of bullets in my direction, trying to cyber secure an IT system on a commercial platform. So that was my last question. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all sticking through the whole hour, and it was great to be here, and thank you for inviting me.